Even as a child, Albert Fish was a very strange individual. After his father died in 1875, his mom sent him to an orphanage where he was frequently beaten, but he actually began to derive sexual pleasure from these beatings. At the age of 12, he engaged in a homosexual relationship with another boy, in which he was introduced to drinking urine and eating feces. This odd behavior escalated to watching other teenage boys undress in public bathrooms, and this eventually escalated to the murder of children. Welcome to history's biggest villains. Albert was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. His father Randall was 75 and his mother Ellen was 32 at the time of his birth. Albert was the youngest of his 3 surviving siblings. Albert's family had an extensive history of mental illness. His uncle was manic, one of his brothers was in a mental hospital, his half-brother was schizophrenic, and his sister Annie had a mental affliction. His mother had hallucinations, and several other family members were diagnosed with mental issues. On October 16, 1875, Albert's father Randall died from a heart attack at a Baltimore train station. Afterwards, his mother put him into St. John's orphanage, where he was routinely beaten. Oddly enough, 5-year-old Albert derived pleasure from the physical pain caused by the beatings. 5 years later, his mother secured a government job and removed him from the orphanage. In 1882, at age 12, Albert began a homosexual relationship with a telegraph boy. The boy showed Albert the practices of urophilia and coprophagia, or the sexual gratification from drinking urine or eating feces. These unusual sexual patterns led him to begin visiting public bathrooms, watching young boys undress. He would spend a majority of his weekends doing this. He would also write obscene letters to random women in the classified ads and marital agencies. When he turned 20, Albert moved to New York City. There, he sold his body and also molested and raped several young boys in the city, with most of his victims being under 6 years old. In 1898, his mother arranged for him to marry Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 19 compared to Albert's 28. The couple had 6 children together before Albert was arrested in 1903 for grand larceny, being incarcerated at Sing Sing prison. Albert later recalled an incident where a male lover took him to a wax museum, where he saw the bisection of a human penis and became obsessed with the thought of genital mutilation. In 1910, while working in Wilmington, Delaware, he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Bedden, whom Albert later implied was mentally disabled. He took Thomas to his house and they began a sadomasochistic relationship, although it is unclear whether Thomas was a willing participant. After 10 days, he took Thomas to an old farmhouse, where he tortured him for 2 weeks. He tied Thomas up and then sliced off half of his penis. I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me, Fish would later recall. He initially intended to kill Thomas, then dismember him, but he feared that the hot weather would attract attention. Instead, he poured peroxide on the wound and wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief. He then kissed Thomas goodbye, leaving a $10 bill with him. Albert later said that he took the first train home and never spoke to Thomas ever again. In January 1917, Albert's wife left him for John Straub, a handyman who was living with them at the time, now forcing him to raise their 6 children by himself. After his wife left him, he began to experience hallucinations. He wrapped himself up in a carpet, stating that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. Also around this time, Albert began to indulge in self-harm for his own sexual satisfaction. This ranged from inserting needles into his groin and abdomen, hitting himself with a nail-covered paddle, and inserting lighter fluid-soaked wool into his anus and setting it on fire. Albert was never known to have physically abused his children, but he would encourage them and their friends to smack his buttocks with the nail-studded paddle. From 1919 to 1930, Albert's violence against children escalated. In 1919, he stabbed a mentally disabled boy in Washington, D.C. He would later claim to occasionally pay older boys to lure children for him. Over the years, he tortured, mutilated, and murdered several young children using his implements of hell: a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a handsaw. On July 11, 1924, Albert saw 8-year-old Beatrice Keel playing alone on her parents' farm in Staten Island, New York. He walked up to her, offering her money to help her look for rhubarb. The little girl was about to leave with him, before her mother appeared and chased him away. Albert left, but later returned to their barn where he tried to sleep. Beatrice's father caught him and forced him to leave. After this incident, Albert, suffering from psychosis, felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children. Albert had been molesting a 10-year-old boy named Cyril Quinn for a while, and he wanted to test his implements of hell on the boy. One day, Cyril and his friend were playing foursquares on the sidewalk when Albert approached them, asking if they had eaten lunch. Since they hadn't, he brought them back to the apartment for sandwiches. After they ate, the two boys were wrestling on the bed when they dislodged a mattress, finding a meat cleaver, a handsaw, and a knife. The boys got scared and ran out of the apartment. Edward Budd was an ambitious 18-year-old. He was determined to make something of himself and escape the desperate poverty of his parents. On May 25, 1928, he put a classified ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. He was a young man who was eager to work and contribute to the well-being of his family. Trapped in the dirty, crowded city in a miserable tenement with his father, mother, and 4 younger siblings, he longed to work in the country where the air was fresh and clean. On the following Monday, May 28th, Edward's mother, Delia, answered the door to an elderly man. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, Long Island, who wanted to interview Edward about a job. Delia then told her 5-year-old daughter Beatrice to get her brother at his friend's apartment. The old man smiled at her and gave her a nickel. While they waited for Edward, Delia had a chance to get a better look at the man. He had a very kindly face, framed with gray hair and accented by a large droopy gray mustache. He explained to Mrs. Budd that he had earned his living for decades as an interior decorator in the city and then retired to a farm that he had bought with his savings. He had 6 children that he raised by himself, since his wife had abandoned them all over a decade ago. With the help of his children, 5 farmhands, and a Swedish cook, he had made the farm into a successful one with several hundred chickens and a half-dozen dairy cows. Now, one of his farmhands was moving on and he needed someone to replace him. At that moment, Edward came in and met Mr. Howard, who remarked at the boy's size and strength. Edward assured the old man that he was a hard worker. Mr. Howard offered him $15 a week and agreed to hire Willie, Edward's closest friend. Mr. Howard had to leave for an appointment and promised to come back on Saturday to pick them up. The boys were thrilled and the Budds were happy that a good position with the kindly old gentleman had come so quickly from Edward's modest ad. Saturday, June 2nd was supposed to be the big day, but Mr. Howard didn't show up. Instead, they got a handwritten note from Mr. Howard saying that he had been delayed and would call in the morning. The next morning around 11, Frank Howard came to the Budds' apartment bringing gifts of strawberries and fresh creamy pot cheese. These products come directly from my farm, he explained. Delia persuaded the old man to stay for lunch. For the first time, Albert Budd Sr. had an opportunity to talk to his son's new employer. It was the kind of talk that made a father very happy. Here was this kind, polite old gentleman describing his 20 acres of farmland, his friendly crew of farmhands, and a simple, hardy country life. He knew it was what his son wanted. Albert Sr. was a porter for the Equitable Life Assurance Company. He was not very impressed by the way Frank looked in his rumpled blue suit, but the old man was credible and kind-natured. When they sat down to lunch, the door opened and a 10-year-old girl appeared. Gracie was humming a song. Coming right from church, she still wore her Sunday clothes, a white silk confirmation dress, white silk stockings, and a string of pearls. Frank couldn't take his eyes off the little girl. "Let's see how good of a counter you are," he said as he handed her a huge wad of bills to count. The impoverished Budds were flabbergasted by the amount of money that this man was carrying around with him. $92.50, Gracie told him in short order. "What a bright little girl," Mr. Howard said, giving her 50 cents to go buy candy for herself and her little sister Beatrice. Howard said that he would come back later in the evening to pick up Edward and Willie, but first he had to go to a birthday party that his sister was throwing for one of her children. He gave the boys $2 to go to the movies. Just as he was about to leave, he invited Gracie to go with him to his niece's birthday party. He would take good care of her and make sure that Gracie was home before 9 o'clock that evening. Delia asked where his sister lived, and he replied that she lived in an apartment house at Columbus and 137th Street. Delia wasn't sure that she should let her go, but Albert Sr. convinced her that it would be good for Gracie. "Let the poor child go. She don't see much good times," he said to her. So Delia helped Grace get her good coat on as well as her gray hat with the streamers. She followed Gracie and Mr. Howard outside and watched them disappear down the street. Frank, or Albert, finally had another child that he could victimize. Initially, he wanted to kill Edward and Willie, as he had brought his favorite weapons of torture and placed them at a newsstand close to the Budd home before he arrived the second time. But now with an unsuspecting little girl, his sadistic urges arose again. Once they both left the house, he stopped back at the newsstand to pick up his bundle of weapons before taking a train to the Bronx and then to the village of Worthington in Westchester. For Grace, he only bought a one-way ticket. Grace was over the moon with the 40-minute ride into the countryside. Only twice in her life had she been out of the city. This was a wonderful treat for her. At the station in Worthington, Albert was so absorbed in his plan that he left his bundle of tools on the train. Ironically, Grace noticed and reminded him to go back and get them. They walked along a remote road until they reached an abandoned two-story building called Wisteria Cottage in the midst of a wooded area. While Grace entertained herself outside with the various wildflowers, Fish went up to the second-floor bedroom, opened up his bundle of tools, and took off his clothes. Then he called for Gracie to come upstairs. With the flowers she had gathered arranged in the bouquet, Gracie came into the house and up to the bedroom. When she saw the old man naked, she screamed for her mother and tried to escape. But Albert had grabbed her by the throat and choked her to death. He was sexually aroused by the act of strangling her. He propped her head up on an old paint can and decapitated her, catching most of the blood in the paint can. Afterwards, he threw the bucket of blood out into the yard. He undressed the headless child. Then he went back to her body and cut it in two with the butcher knife and cleaver. Parts of her body he took with him wrapped in newspaper. The rest he left there until he returned several days later, when he threw the portions of her body over a stone wall in the back of the house. He disposed of his tools in the same fashion. Albert would eat the rest of Gracie's remains over the next several weeks. That evening, the Budds never received any word from Mr. Howard, and there was no sign of Gracie. A terrible sleepless night with no message from their daughter. The next morning, young Edward was sent down to the police station to report his sister's disappearance. Police Lieutenant Samuel Dribbin said to the Budds that the address that Frank Howard had given them for his sister's apartment was fake. The old man was a fraud. There was no Frank Howard, no farm in Farmingdale, Long Island. None of it was true. On November 12, 1934, over 6 years after Gracie's disappearance, Delia received an anonymous letter, but since she was illiterate, she asked Edward to read it, and afterwards he sped out the door into the police department. The letter said, "My dear Miss Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco for Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At the time, there was famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy's or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7, one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked and tied them in a closet, and then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy, because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven. All of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, and stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street. He told me so often how good human flesh is. I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped off all my clothes. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her though. I could have if I wished. She died a virgin. What the fuck is this? Police investigated the letter, and although the story concerning Captain Davis and the famine in Hong Kong cannot be verified, the part of the letter concerning the murder of Grace, however, was found to be accurate in its description, although it was impossible to confirm whether or not Fish had actually eaten parts of Grace's body. The letter was delivered in an envelope that had a small hexagonal emblem with the letters NYPCBA, meaning the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. A janitor at the company told the police he had taken the envelope home and left it at his rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street when he moved out. The landlady of the rooming house said that Fish checked out of that room a few days earlier. She said that Fish's son sent him money and he asked her to hold his next check for him. Detective William King, the chief investigator of the case, walked outside the room until Fish returned. He agreed to go with King for questioning, then brandished a razor blade at the officer. King quickly disarmed Fish and took him to the police station. Fish immediately confessed to the murder of Grace Budd, saying that he meant to go to the house to kill her brother Edward. Fish said it never even entered his head to rape the girl, but he later claimed to his attorney that while kneeling on Grace's chest and strangling her, he did have 2 involuntary ejaculations. During the night of July 14, 1924, 9-year-old Francis McDonald was reported missing after he didn't return home after playing catch with friends in Staten Island. A search was organized and his body was found hanging from a tree in a wooded area near his home. He had been sexually assaulted and then strangled by his suspenders. According to an autopsy, McDonald had also suffered extensive cuts to his legs and abdomen, and his left hamstring had almost been completely stripped of flesh. Fish refused to claim responsibility for this, although he later stated that he intended to castrate the boy, but fled when he heard someone approaching the area. McDonald's friends told the police that he was taken by an elderly man with a gray mustache. A neighbor also told the police he observed a boy with a similar looking man walking along a grassy path in the nearby woods. Francis's mother, Anna McDonald, said she saw the same man earlier that day, telling reporters, "He came shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself and making queer motions with his hands. I saw his thick gray hair and his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray." This description resulted in the mysterious stranger being known as the Gray Man. The McDonald murder remained unsolved until after the murder of Budd, when several eyewitnesses, among them the Staten Island farmer Hans Keel, positively identified Fish as the odd stranger seen in the area on the day of McDonald's disappearance. Richmond County District Attorney Thomas Walsh announced his intention to seek an indictment against Fish for the boy's murder. On February 11, 1927, 3-year-old Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother were playing in the apartment hallway of Brooklyn with 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. When the 12-year-old left for his apartment, both younger boys disappeared. Beaton was later found on the roof of the apartments. When asked what happened to Gaffney, Beaton said the boogeyman took him. Gaffney's body was never recovered. Initially, serial killer Peter Kudzanowski was a suspect in Gaffney's murder. Then, Joseph Meehan, a motorman on a Brooklyn trolley, saw a picture of Fish in a newspaper and identified him as the old man he saw on February 11th. The man had been trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him on the trolley. The boy was not wearing a jacket, was crying for his mother, and was dragged by the man off and on the trolley. Beaton's description of the boogeyman matched Fish. Police matched the description of the child to Gaffney. Detectives of the Manhattan Missing Persons Bureau were able to establish that Fish was employed as a house painter by a Brooklyn real estate company during February 1927, and that on the day of Gaffney's disappearance, he was working at a location a few miles from where the boy was abducted. Gaffney's mother, Elizabeth, visited Fish in Sing Sing, accompanied by Detective King. She wanted to ask him about her son's death, but Fish refused to speak to her. However, Fish claimed the following in a letter to his attorney. "I brought him to the Riker Ave dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the boy there, stripped him naked and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took the trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day, about 2 p.m., I took tools, a good heavy cat of 9 tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these half into 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, and slit his mouth from ear to ear. Gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, ears, and a few slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below his belly button, then through his legs at about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and legs below the knee. Then I put in sacks weighed with stones, tied the ends, and threw them in the pools of slimy water you will see along the road going to North Beach. The water is about 3 to 4 feet deep. They sank at once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked the best, his monkey and peewees, and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. Then I split the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewees, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put it in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when meat was roasted for about 15 minutes, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet little fat behind did. I ate every bit of meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was as sweet as a nut, but his peewees I could not chew. Threw them in the toilet. Oh my God, this is so disgusting. This is so disgusting. Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began on March 11, 1935 in White Plains, New York. Frederick P. Close presided as judge, and Westchester County Chief Assistant District Attorney Albert F. Gallagher was prosecuting attorney. Fish's defense counsel was James Dempsey, a former prosecutor and the one-time mayor of Peekskill, New York. The trial lasted for 10 days. Fish pleaded insanity and claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to kill children. Several psychiatrists testified about Fish's sexual fetishes, which included sadism and masochism, flagellation, exhibitionism, voyeurism, piquerism, cannibalism, coprophagia, urophilia, pedophilia, necrophilia, and fibulation. Dempsey in his summation noted that Fish was a psychiatric phenomenon and that nowhere in legal or medical records was there another individual that possessed so many sexual abnormalities. None of the jurors doubted that Fish was insane, but ultimately, as one later explained, they felt that he should be executed anyway. They found him to be sane and guilty, and the judge sentenced the defendant to death by electrocution. Fish arrived at prison in March 1935 and was executed on January 16, 1936 in the electric chair at Sing Sing. He entered the chamber at 11:06 p.m. and was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. He was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery. Fish was said to have helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body. According to one witness present, it took 2 jolts before Fish died, creating the rumors that the apparatus was short-circuited by the needles that Fish inserted into his body. These rumors later regarded as untrue, as Fish reportedly died in the same fashion and time frame as others in the electric chair. At a meeting with reporters after the execution, Fish's lawyer James Dempsey revealed that he was in possession of his client's final statement. This amounted to several pages of handwritten notes that Fish scribbled down in the hours leading to his death. When pressed by journalists to reveal the document's contents, Dempsey refused, stating, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Jesus Christ, man. I don't even know what to say. I don't know what to say. I really don't know what to say. That might have been the most disgusting thing I've ever read. Those 2 letters were probably the most disgusting things I've ever read in my life. Because when you're reading it, your brain automatically creates a visual. And it's just like I know I've read about some nasty stuff on the channel, but that was disgusting. Oh my God, it's so disgusting. I'm glad they killed that man. This dude was corrupted from the beginning. You're 5 years old and you already have a pain fetish. You're already experiencing homosexuality at 12 and doing these types of eating feces and drinking urine. Like, you're already destined to be a psychopath at this point. But, bruh, oh my god. Man, leave a like if you enjoyed this crazy story. Turn on my post notifications if you haven't already. Please be safe, stay on the grind. I'm out. Peace.